I spent the last 2 decades working at Old Frank's pub, pouring pints and listening to the town's stories. Frank's pub was more than just a job to me. It was like a second home. The worn wooden bar, the cozy booths, the smell of stale beer mixed with the scent of roasting meat from the kitchen. It was all part of me. The regulars were like family, and every corner of that place held a memory. But deep down, I always dreamed of having my own pub, a place I could call mine, where I could be the one behind the bar welcoming people in. My name is Vlad, and this is the story of how I made that dream a reality. Frank was a gruff, old-school kind of guy. He'd owned the pub for as long as anyone in town could remember. The pub had been his father's before him, and his grandfather's before that. It was a family legacy, and Frank took pride in it. But Frank was getting old, and though he never said it out loud, I could see the years weighing on him. The pub was his life, but it was also becoming a burden. The long hours, the upkeep, the constant demands of running a business. It was wearing him down. One night, after the last customer had staggered out and we were closing up, Frank and I sat down for a drink. We didn't usually do this. Frank wasn't the sentimental type, but that night felt different. He seemed more reflective, more open. "Vlad," he said, staring into his glass, "I'm not as young as I used to be. Running this place, it's getting harder." I nodded, unsure where he was going with this. I'd seen Frank tired before, but this was different. There was a sadness in his voice, a weariness that made me worry about him. "I've been thinking," he continued, "about what's going to happen to this place when I'm gone." I looked at him, surprised. Frank never talked about the future, especially not about what would happen when he was no longer around. The pub was his life, and it was hard to imagine it without him behind the bar. "I've been here a long time," I said carefully. "I've learned a lot from you. Maybe I could help more, take on some of the responsibilities." Frank looked at me, his eyes narrowing as if he was considering something. Then he sighed, shaking his head. "I appreciate that, Vlad. But this place, it needs more than just someone to run it. It needs someone who loves it as much as I do. Someone who sees it not just as a job, but as their life." I didn't know what to say. Of course, I loved the pub, but it wasn't mine. It was Frank's, and it always had been. As the days went by, I couldn't stop thinking about what Frank had said. I loved the pub. I had spent 20 years of my life there, pouring my heart and soul into every pint I served. But owning it, that was a different story. I didn't have the money to buy it. And even if I did, I wasn't sure Frank would sell it. It was his legacy, after all. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that owning a pub had always been my dream. Not just any pub, this pub. The one I'd grown to love. The one that felt like home. But how could I make that happen? I didn't have the money to buy it. And I certainly couldn't compete with the big businesses that might be interested if Frank ever decided to sell. That's when I started thinking about something I'd heard about years ago. Neville Goddard's teachings. I wasn't a particularly spiritual person, but I'd always been intrigued by the idea that our thoughts could shape our reality. Neville talked about imagining your desired outcome as if it had already happened, about living in the feeling of your wish fulfilled. It sounded simple, almost too simple, but I figured I had nothing to lose. Every night, after the pub closed and I was lying in bed, I started to imagine what it would be like to own the pub. I pictured myself behind the bar, not as an employee, but as the owner. I imagined making decisions, welcoming customers, and feeling the pride of knowing that this place was mine. I tried to feel the emotions that would come with that, the satisfaction, the excitement, the love for the place I'd built. At first, it felt a little silly. I'd lie there, picturing myself as the owner of a pub I had no way of buying, and it seemed like nothing more than a fantasy. But I kept at it. Every night, I'd spend a few minutes before falling asleep living in that imagined reality. I'd walk through the pub in my mind, touching the bar, greeting customers, feeling the weight of the keys in my pocket. I tried to make it as real as possible, to feel it in every part of my being. Weeks passed and nothing changed. I started to wonder if I was wasting my time, but something inside me told me to keep going. I didn't tell anyone about what I was doing. It was too personal, too strange to share. But every night, I kept imagining, kept living in that dream world where the pub was mine. Then one day, something unexpected happened. Frank called me into his office, something he rarely did. I walked in, unsure of what to expect, and found him sitting behind his desk, a serious look on his face. "Vlad," he said, "I've been doing a lot of thinking. You've been with me for a long time, and I know how much this place means to you. I've decided it's time for me to step back." My heart skipped a beat. Was this really happening? Was he about to offer me what I'd been dreaming of? "I don't have any family to pass this place on to," Frank continued, "and I don't want to see it go to someone who won't care for it like I have. I've been watching you, Vlad. I see how much you care about this place, how much you care about the people who come here. I want you to have it." For a moment, I couldn't speak. The words didn't seem real, like I was still dreaming. But Frank's eyes were steady, and I realized this was really happening. He was offering me the pub. I don't know what to say. I stammered, my mind racing. "I don't have the money to buy it from you." Frank waved his hand dismissively. "I don't care about that. I've made my money, and I've lived my life. What matters to me is that this place is in good hands, and I believe you are the right person for the job." I felt a surge of emotion, gratitude, disbelief, excitement, all swirling together. This was everything I dreamed of, everything I'd been working towards in my mind, and now it was happening. "I won't let you down," I said, my voice thick with emotion. "I'll take care of it, I promise." Frank nodded, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "I know you will, Vlad. That's why I'm giving it to you." In the weeks that followed, the transfer of ownership was finalized. Frank showed me all the ins and outs of running the business, the finances, the suppliers, the paperwork. It was a lot to take in, but I was eager to learn. This was my chance, and I wasn't going to waste it. A few months after I took over, Frank passed away quietly in his sleep. It was a sad day for the town. He was a fixture in the community, and his loss was felt by everyone who knew him. We held a wake at the pub, and people came from all over to pay their respects. It was a testament to the impact Frank had on the town and the love people had for him. As I stood behind the bar that night, pouring drinks and listening to stories about Frank, I felt a deep sense of responsibility. This place was more than just a business. It was a legacy, a part of the town's history. I wanted to honor Frank's memory by keeping it alive, by making it a place where people could come together and feel at home. But I also wanted to make it my own. I started making small changes. Nothing too drastic, just little things to put my own stamp on the place. I introduced new events, like live music nights and trivia contests. I updated the menu, bringing in some of my favorite dishes, and I made sure that everyone who walked through the door felt welcome, just like Frank had taught me. The pub thrived under my ownership. The regulars kept coming back, and new customers started to find their way in. I worked hard, but it didn't feel like work. This was my dream, and I was living it every day. I couldn't help but think about the journey that had brought me here. If you had told me a year ago that I'd be the owner of Frank's Pub, I wouldn't have believed you. But now, standing behind the bar with the keys in my pocket, I knew that anything was possible if you believed in it enough. Neville Goddard's teachings had seemed like a strange idea at first, but now I saw the truth in them. By imagining my dream as if it had already happened, I had somehow brought it into reality. The pub became my life, just as it had been Frank's, but it was more than that. It was my passion, my purpose. I poured everything I had into making it a success, and the town responded. People came not just for the drinks or the food, but for the atmosphere, the sense of community that I worked so hard to create. Years passed, and the pub continued to thrive. I never forgot Frank and what he had done for me. I kept a picture of him behind the bar, a reminder of the man who had given me the opportunity of a lifetime. And every night, as I locked up and turned off the lights, I took a moment to reflect on how far I'd come. I was living my dream, and I knew that I had Frank, and perhaps a little bit of Neville Goddard's wisdom, to thank for it. As I walked out of the pub and into the night, the cool air filling my lungs, I felt a deep sense of gratitude. I had a life I loved, a place I belonged, and a legacy to carry forward. The pub was mine, and I knew that as long as I kept believing, kept working hard, and kept caring for it, it would always be a place where people could come to feel at home. And that, more than anything, was the greatest gift I could have ever received.